Joe Rogan talks about the 5 conspiracy theories that will shock you. Dismissed as a quest for relevance by some wannabes, conspiracy theories have over time been presented in a negative light. This is expected as these theorists often have little to no evidence to back their claims. But let's look on the brighter side. Are these lack of valid pieces of evidence to back up claims a result of good cover-ups? Or do we leave it entirely to the notion that people who propagate them are just delusional? Welcome back to Declassified Theories. Do subscribe to the channel if you are new here, and join us as we unravel some mysteries. Let's go on. History is filled with so many gaps that stir up inquiries in later times. There are some who believe that unraveling some of these mysteries totally depends on verifiable data. And where this is absent, a continuous inquiry into things most acceptable. Most often, when you look hard enough, lines can be drawn to link events and happenings in a most spectacular and convincing manner. This point here is the birthplace of most conspiracy theories. And in this video, we will be looking at 5 of the most convincing theories Joe Rogan and his guests have unveiled in his podcast, in a quest to shed some light on some of the problems that have remained mysteries over the years. Number 5. The Lost City of Atlantis. A mystical city covered in gold. This conspiracy has been one of the most popular, with several movies built around the story. On this episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, his guest speaker, Jimmy, who is also an investigator, shares this theory about the lost city of Atlantis. According to Jimmy, the city might not be so mythical after all. He talks about a location in the Western Sahara Desert of Mauritania called the Reshot Structure, aka the Eye of the Sahara. And what he says here is really interesting. He bases his idea on the known descriptions of the location of Atlantis and tries to point out these landmarks around the Eye of the Sahara. Outside just being a volcanic structure, as basically described by geologists, this structure amazingly fits in with several of Plato's descriptions of the lost city of Atlantis. First, the capital Atlantis is a capital of an empire made up of 10 kingdoms and is described to be made up of concentric circles. And if you observe the structure, it is just the most obvious feature there, and described to have had an opening to the Sea of the South. And another obvious thing about the Reshot structure is that water must have run through it. The Atlas mountain chain is another interesting feature, given that the king of Atlantis is known as Atlas. And years later, the name of the very first king of Mauritania is named Atlas. This points to the way names are transferred along the lineage. And the city was said to have been paved with gold. And the most insane thing is that the richest man ever known, Mansa Musa of Mali, hailed from the region. This will be a perfect explanation for his massive wealth. So, is the lost city of Atlantis only just a mystery? Number 4. Antarctica spotted on ancient maps. Graham Hancock, a British writer who specializes in the advancement of pseudoscientific theories, has been a frequent guest on Joe Rogan's podcasts. In this episode, we see him make some fascinating claims, pointing to prior knowledge of Antarctica before 1820. This was the year, although still debated, when voyagers claimed to have come across these icy lands. Evidence shows Antarctica is clearly represented in great detail in the Waldseemüller world map. This is unlike what was shown in the later Pinkerton world maps of the 1800s, made prior to 1820, that had nothing regarding Antarctica. The most amazing thing about this is that older maps, such as the Waldseemüller map, were made in the 1500s, and people who made these depended largely on older maps for their data. Couldn't there have been civilizations in the past that were more advanced than we think them to be? Graham thinks this to be clear proof that somehow, somewhere, there have been lost civilizations, and these subtle findings are just the past. seeing its echoes through the present times, and the details in these older maps are nothing less than intriguing. Number 3. Weird experiments by Benjamin Franklin. The history of the United States is one filled with men who had achieved spectacular goals to help foster the advancements of the nation. Many believed that the American identity begins, to a large extent, with Benjamin Franklin. To this day, he is the face of the $100 bill. In politics, Benjamin made his mark as one of the founding fathers of the United States and has his signature on the Declaration of Independence. He is also prominent in the sciences for some amazing inventions such as the lightning rod, bifocals amongst other things, and his scientific inquiries that contributed largely to scholarship. However, in 1997, more than 200 years from the time he lived, Benjamin's story takes a little dark turn. An article published by the Smithsonian Magazine details the finding. It has it that 1,200 pieces of bones were discovered, and this is estimated to have belonged to at least 12 people, about 6 of which were children. These bodies could have been buried there at any time over the years, some may think. But the most shocking things about this is that forensic investigations show that these bones rightly date back to the time that Benjamin lived. For anyone, this stirs questions and concerns over the image of a national hero. As a result, further investigations have tied the likely sources of the bodies to one of Benjamin's closest allies, William Hewson, who was suspected to have been engaged in the study of human anatomy and used the Craven Street house as cover, exploiting Benjamin's high standing in the society. At the time, anatomy took a really dark turn as the supply of bodies needed for studies was really low. And we have here in one of the extracts from Mental Floss, included in the article published by the Smithsonian, which reads, "Anatomy was still in its infancy, but the day's social and ethical mores frowned upon it. A steady supply of human bodies was hard to come by legally. So, Hewson, Hunter, and the field's other pioneers had to turn to grave robbing, either paying professional resurrection men to procure cadavers or digging them up themselves to get their hands on specimens. At the time, such a discovery would have come with grave consequences, and knowing whether or not Benjamin was directly involved is a question that is likely to remain largely unanswered." Number 2. U.S. moon landing was a fake. Focusing on the body language of the NASA representatives in a press conference following up the moon landing reveals some interesting things about this event in history. And not just that, a review of the footage from space travel has sparked wild criticisms that support that it could have been a deep fake. In the 1960s, the struggle for military supremacy was at its peak between America and the Soviet Union. The launching of the Sputnik by the USSR alerted the American authorities to their advancements, and this required a response to measure up. This necessitated the pledge by Kennedy in 1961 to have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. These events have fueled the inquisitive inquiry into the moon landing. Since it was done out of desperation to retain superiority, many think this makes it likely to be a charade. Joe Rogan's episode on this calls out the nervous looks on the face of the NASA officials who had a press conference about the moon landing. According to him, they looked like they were being made to say whatever they were about to say. Also, the US flag in the video appears to be moving. This is interesting because space is said to be a vacuum. Some have tried to play around with this, however. But also, looking at the movement of the astronauts, it appears to be controlled. And the fact that we have not been able to see a repeat of the moon landing, despite the amazing advancement we have now, does leave room for questions. Number 1. 9/11 was an inside job. The September 2001 attack remains shocking to Americans to this day. Such a deadly attack coming so deep to the heart of the town was not imaginable. Joe Rogan calls attention to a really interesting detail regarding the period. Donald Rumsfeld, the then U.S. Secretary of Defense, had made some shocking revelation to the public a couple days before the terrorist attack that will alter the lives of many. He had revealed that they had found an error that they couldn't account for $2.3 trillion. The fact that this is less talked about in relation to follow-up events to 9/11 is quite interesting. This is because, just after the announcement, the accounting section of the building that was supposed to be responsible for the investigations into the missing fund conveniently blew up. According to Rogan, he loves talking about this because it sounds really good. And when you really think about it, it really does sound interesting. Conspiracies often provide resources to fill up gaps that are found on different occasions where facts seem to elude. Conspiracy theories are always faulted because they often lay claims to the existence of some cover-up, and the fact that fingers always point at some powerful body as complicit, there's always a big campaign to label them as lies. Do you think there are some truth in these stories? Or are they just some well-constructed deception? Let us know what your thoughts are in the comments section, and subscribing to the channel will be appreciated.